Good morning. I'm Charla Muller, a member of Providence. I teach occasionally in the Bridge Builder Sunday School class. My husband, Brad, our two children, and I have been members of the church for 20 years, and I'm delighted to be with you today. This Advent series is called Sharing the Story, and this week's lesson stems from Exodus 17:6. The scripture says, "I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. Advent is about the preparation for and anticipation of the coming of Christ. For United Methodists, it's a time when we remember the longing of God's chosen people for a Messiah, and we reflect on our own longing for forgiveness, salvation, and new beginnings. Exodus 17:6 is an important Old Testament reference to the coming of Christ and can help anchor us during the time of Advent. To better understand the scripture, it's important to understand the context of this part of the actual Exodus. According to some scholars, the Israelites were 60 days into a 40-year trek. That's about 200 steps into a 26-mile marathon. And thus far, God had delivered on his promises of guidance and safety. Under God's direction, Moses parted the Red Sea with his God-anointed staff so that the Israelites could safely flee Egypt and Pharaoh and those horrible plagues. God promised safety and direction. He provided a pillar of cloud to guide the Israelites during the day and a pillar of fire to comfort and warm them at night. And God promised sustenance, including water and manna, literally bread from heaven. But as God's people were getting acclimated to this marathon journey, which, while God sanctioned and God directed, was not easy and hardly luxurious, they settled at a new camp and ran into what they perceived as a major issue. There was no water source at this new camp. Remember, this is not a small squad of travelers. According to Exodus 12, there are about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, and some estimate that this is a conservative number. So let's face it, no water is kind of a big deal. Even today, lack of access to potable drinking water qualifies as a crisis. And while God's people had experienced miracle after miracle, here they are at this new place, literally in the middle of a nowhere of sorts. They're tired, they're worn out, and there's no water. And they wonder where God is in the midst of this nowhere place. And so they come at Moses. They're snarky and demanding. "Are you serious? No water? You brought us this far only to have our children and our livestock die of thirst?" The scripture tells us that Moses feared he would be stoned by the disgruntled Israelites. Some scholars suggest that this is comparable to us impeaching a leader today. People were fired up. This was the overthrow of a government of sorts. In turn, Moses is frustrated. Why are the Israelites so quarrelsome? Why are they challenging God? God has brought them this far. Are his chosen people still not convinced of his fidelity, his provision, his plan? It's just a huge bicker fest. 200 steps into a 26-mile marathon of sorts. So Moses goes to God and asks, "What's the plan? Your people are pushing back on me. They don't think you are here, present in this place." And God does something really interesting. He tells Moses to grab his staff and some of the more credible dissenters. And God tells Moses that he, God, will stand before them by a rock, and that Moses should take his staff and strike the rock where God stands, and that water will come from the rock for God's chosen people to drink. I know there's a lot there. First, scholars and theologians note that normally we are the ones called into God's presence, not the other way around. But in this passage, to show Moses where the water is, God says to him instead, "I will stand before you." Scholars suggest that this is the first reference to God stepping into our space to atone for us. Second, it's a rock. Can you imagine? Okay, God is going to go stand by that rock before Moses. Moses is going to hit the rock with his big stick, his staff, and that blow to the rock will release enough water to quench the thirst of all of God's people. It's really a staggering visual if you think about it. And it becomes a reference point throughout the New Testament and gives us a glimpse of what is to come, a glimpse of our salvation. In 1 Corinthians 10:4, Paul reflects on Israel's time in the desert and tells us that the people drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. This Exodus miracle is a picture of how God rescues us. After the miracle, Moses names this area Massah and Meribah, which means to quarrel and to test. He didn't name it the miracle rock, or the rock where God delivered his people yet again, or even Geyserville. The area was not named for God's awesomeness, but for his people's skeptical reaction to his awesomeness. Perhaps Massah and Meribah might serve as a thoughtful reminder of our ongoing battle with our sinful, quarrelsome, and crusty natures, of our struggle to trust God and his plan for us, of our inability to see God's promises living out in our lives every day, including when, or especially when, we're in the wilderness. This Old Testament scripture reminds us that despite our quarrelsome and crusty behavior, God never abandons us, and further, will always, always quench our spiritual thirst, not because of who we are, but because of who God is. God sending his son to die for our sin, to become our rock, is the central miracle of our faith. Every other miracle in the Bible, including Moses striking the rock to release water to save all of God's chosen people, is in service to the miracle we prepare for during Advent.